Hello everybody and welcome back to the Fortress of Solitude. Today we're going to be checking out Action Comics issue 1069 by Gail Simone, Eddie Barrows, Rainbow Rowell, and Sian Tormey. Gail Simone's three-part story comes to a close as Superman is crowned the winner of the arena battle, having saved Kandor and survived the deadly gauntlet of tricks and traps. Gail Simone encapsulates Superman's champion of the people moniker perfectly across these first two pages. He beat the odds and came out on top and proved not just to the people of Earth, but to the dozens of aliens watching that there is hope and it's bloody hard to kill. The injured Superman is taken away by the mechanical monsters as Grunhard tries to determine why people cheer for a beaten and broken man, and luckily his underling Gore shows him a report Cat Grant is currently giving, citing how Superman does not fight alone and Earth fights with him. Lois meanwhile has ventured deeper into the ship to find the Daxamite, Hoxer, who is to be primed to fight Superman. Lois does her best to try and reason with the being, citing how he appears to be a prisoner of the Corinthians as well, so maybe Superman and him can team up to defeat them, but Hux isn't interested in any of that, seeing Superman as an obstacle he must overcome. As I said in my review of the previous issue, I like that Simone is taking Lois and Jimmy and doing the usual journalist story with them, but doing it on an alien megaship. It adds an unknown factor to the run-of-the-mill story of characters doing this and keeps them involved in Superman's ongoing story and ties them back into it really nicely later on. Speaking of Superman, since the Gorithians can't find Jimmy or Lois, they are forced to select two new seconds to fight with Superman in the final battle. Luckily, thanks to Superman's inspirational battle to save Kandor, many of the aliens on board the ship want to help out. Superman gets a fantastic moment here where he calls Grunhard into his little locker room area and gives him one final chance to surrender, and I love it's just with a single look Clark sows the seeds of doubt into Grunhard's mind and maybe he actually might lose, and he does it while covered in bandages and barely being able to stand. Superman soon meets with his seconds, Koma of Kund and Tamanal, a Thanagarian, and the final challenge begins. Gore thinks that Superman should just stand down, but Clark refuses to, and I really like how he can't quite explain why he can't just surrender, but he just needs to know he needs to continue on and do what's right. Superman and his new friends are teleported into the octagon above Tokyo, where they are to fight Hoxer, with the first being knocked out of bounds, declared the loser. It's really cool that Superman is given every opportunity to make the fight a little easier. He is offered weapons and opportunities like Tamanao telling him to hit below the belt and fight dirty, but Superman refuses to do any of that, preferring to be a more honest fighter and have a more honest approach. We finally get to see Hoxer here, and I love Eddie Barrows' design for him. He's unlike any Daxamite we've actually seen before. Instead, he's just this more huge hulking monster. He's like a walking muscle. Unlike any Daxamite we've seen, they've always been very slender and very human-like. They've basically just been Kryptonians. But this guy is unlike any we've seen before, and he carries a giant axe and a cool predator wrist gauntlet on one hand. Now Hoxer proves almost too much for Superman, almost knocking him out of the ring with his giant axe. Like with Grunhard, Superman gives him a chance to stop the fight, but when he doesn't, Clark doesn't mess around, matching Huck's punch for punch. Lois meanwhile finds Jimmy, who has put his signal watch onto the bottled city of Kandor, waiting for Lex to do his thing and up the frequency on it. Now I really don't think that Lex was actually needed in this story at all. He's barely in it, and his part in the story could have just been rolled into Lois and Jimmy's quite easily. Like Jimmy could have activated the signal watch and it would have resulted in the same outcome as it does a little later on in the book, and we'll get to that. So his storyline, or his involvement in the storyline, was really nothing, and I think it was just to kind of include Lex in the story because it's, Superman, you got to include Lex Luthor. He doesn't even appear at the end of the issue where you think he would, like in some form, but he just doesn't. It's a very strange use of him, and it's probably the only thing I don't like about Simone's story here, the misuse of Lex. It's not even a misuse, it's just lack of use, really. Superman meanwhile discovers that Hoxer has been using kryptonite against him, given to him by Grunhard to weaken the Man of Steel. Learning the kryptonite is not making the fight an even fight and actually making it easier, Hux throws it away into the atmosphere, causing Superman to regain his full power, laying a beat down on Hux and driving him out of the arena before the villain can do anything about it. Lois and Jimmy arrive in the nick of time, and we learn that Jimmy and Lex were up to something, and that something was turning the Signal Watcher's frequency up and blasting the bottle city of Kandor with it, freeing the Kandorians within, who back up Superman when he confronts Grunha about cheating in the battle. This leads to my favourite moment of the issue, where Superman, always the good sport, helps up Huxer, offering him a hand when he needed it the most. Superman isn't finished though, as he returns to business as usual now that the aliens are gone, helping the police arrest Mr. Brewood, who was scamming the youth centre set up by Mr. Pierce in the beginning of the first issue. And after dealing with him, Superman joins the kids at the youth centre to play some basketball. And that's a really nice ending to the arc, Superman remembering and helping out the little guy after a massive, literal world-ending threat is dealt with, because that's what he finds most important, and why Superman fights in the first place is the little things. Now Gale's story isn't the only story, as Rainbow Rowell and Sian Tormey wrap up their Lois and Clark backup, with Lois coming to meet her husband on the roof of the Daily Planet so they can hash out what's been going on between them. As I assumed in my last review, we did get a bit of a lesson here for Clark and for Lois, and it's about there being certain rules you gotta follow as a journalist, and I really like that Clark can finally see what Lois was trying to do here, even admitting that he was embarrassed to be caught in a small loophole of the rules he usually follows to a T. Even he wasn't really aware of it, and Lois doing what she did kind of opened his eyes to it. Lois also admits that being an editor is taking a toll on her, since how could she run news about her husband, and I love that Rainbow frames the whole Superman-Clark duality thing with Lois here, as Lois does not see that. She only sees one man, not two men fighting for, power in some sort of relationship. It's just her husband. That's all she sees, and I really like that, and that makes it all the much harder for her to run these stories. Lois considers stepping down as editor, but Clark convinces her to stay on, citing how her putting him on the human interest story beat was a rather eye-opening experience, which I assumed it would be as a way to help ground Clark a little bit and let him see where Lois was coming from. Lois's reasonings for Clark to be put on that beat were great as well, citing how everyone in the bullpen is a bit too cynical and chasing the big bad news, always expecting something terrible to happen. But Clark never does that, and he always holds the little things in his sight, and little things are what make this world wondrous. After patching things up, Lois asks if Clark wants to be moved back onto the Superman beat, and he does, but only if it feels right, and he won't take it straight away. And he wants to stick with the human interest stories, since he's become very interested in them. But Lois reveals that he's going to need to help Mariposa on her story though, since the intern actually passed on the story thanks to a conflict of interest, since Superman saved her from Atomic Skull at the end of the last issue. Clark gets a little jab in about Lois not caring about the conflict of interest when he first saved her and it cost her a Pulitzer, and the couple move on to finish their latest front page article. This was just a really nice relationship focused story, and I really enjoyed it dealt with some situations that you would think would come up a little bit more with Lois and Clark and their work life, but it never really does. And I can see why some writers maybe don't want to do that. Maybe they don't think that's interesting, or they don't think that's going to sell comics. It's not action, it's not Superman out there punching villains, and I get that, but I really love these type of stories. These are what inform the characters, and it was a little bit predictable where the story was headed, especially after the first issue. You could kind of tell where it was going to end, but it was still a wonderful little slice of our hero's life. Action Comics issue 1069 rounded out a Superman Superstars initiative with a very satisfying story from Gail Simone, filled with action, suspense, and most importantly, wonderful take on the Man of Steel. Coupled with Rainbow Rowell's more Lois and Clark focused work on the backup, you can't really go wrong with this issue, as it's got everything I love about Superman in it. I'm going to give this issue a 10 out of 10.